Good morning. Today is the 11th day of Iyar, the 19th of May. And we're starting our next Torah reading, Behar. Behar means at the mountain. And here the Torah is talking about the moral laws that were given when the Jewish people were still encamped around Mount Sinai. And our parsha begins, the first reading begins with the mitzvah of the sabbatical year. This commandment means that once every 7 years, we need to give the land, give the earth a rest. Just as we rest on the seventh day, just as God rested on the seventh day of creation, so the earth has to rest also. And the verse we're going to focus on is Leviticus 25:2. Speak to the Israelites. You must say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, the land must rest by observing an agricultural Sabbath in honor of God. Now what we're going to focus on is the last two words, Shabbat LaHashem, which means a Sabbath, which is, here it was translated as in honor of God, but it doesn't have to mean in honor of God. It means for God. And why is this connected? Why does the Torah have to tell us that you should observe a sabbatical year for God? Apparently, we're doing it for the earth. The earth is the one that's benefiting from the sabbatical year. So there's an exceptional teaching from Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and he writes like this about this verse, a Sabbath to God. He says, it is written in the writings of the Arizal regarding this verse, and you shall speak unto the children of Israel, saying, my Sabbath you shall safeguard. In Exodus 31:13, we find that when Moses is commanded to speak about the Sabbath to the Israelites, God tells him, you should safeguard the Sabbath, my Sabbath. He doesn't say there's a Sabbath. He doesn't say there's Shabbat. He says it's my Shabbat. Et Shabtotai tishmoru. Why does he say it that way? So the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, he quotes the Torah. The Torah is one of the early medieval compilations of the law. And he writes like this, he says that during the time of enslavement in Egypt, Moses requested Pharaoh to allow the Jews to rest 1 day per week from their labor. So Moses wanted to make their life easier. He didn't come with an injunction from God. He just came and said, if I can do anything to lessen their suffering, I will. So when he came before Pharaoh, he was allowed to come before Pharaoh. This was also uncommon for a Jew to be able to do that. So he said, I'll make a request. And he requested that the people be allowed to rest 1 day a week. And Moses himself chose the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. By the way, it's very interesting. If you study ancient Egyptian history, especially their science and astronomy, you'll see that they did not use, or at least according to most accounts, they didn't use a 7-day week. It was very uncommon in the ancient world. All of the ancient world used a 7-day week. There's a lot of questions about where this came from, but in any case, the Egyptians didn't. They had a 10-day week. And so by suggesting that they would get a rest every seventh day, Moses was not just suggesting a day of rest, he was also suggesting changing the whole calendar. The Egyptian calendar was based on 36, I guess we can call them weeks, of 10 days each. And he was suggesting a switch to a 7-day week calendar. Moses didn't get this from God, apparently. He just wanted to make their life easier. So when he was commanded to tell us about the Sabbath, he rejoiced in his portion, says the Torah. Why did he rejoice in this portion? Because he had previously conceived of it as a day of rest. Where did he get it from? We don't know. But it turned out that he was exactly intuitively aligned with the divine will. And that's why God told him, you shall speak and tell them, my Sabbaths you shall keep. In other words, keep the Sabbath not because Moses thought it was a good idea to rest one day out of every 7 days, but rather because I, God, am commanding you to rest. Now this is one of the cornerstones of Judaic thought. Torah thought says that the reason that we perform the commandments is not because they are naturally advantageous or beneficial to us. The primary reason why we perform the commandments is because it is a sabbatical for God. It is my Sabbath, because the divine will so declares, and not because there's some natural inclination for us to do this. So what does this mean? It means that the commandments of the Torah are not against nature. In fact, you can usually find a reason why they have natural advantages, why they actually are beneficial to us naturally. But the whole purpose of the Torah is to take us to a higher level, which is not reasoning according to what is beneficial to me. Rather, what does God want? What's the idea behind that? The idea is that if my performance of the commandments is because they suit me, because my rational mind says that they make sense, then I haven't connected anywhere but with my rational mind. Now, the whole point of connecting to God is connecting to that which is beyond my rational, that which is beyond the way I perceive reality in my life. The whole point is to go beyond the natural to get to the supernatural. And the supernatural here doesn't necessarily mean miracles, but it means that there is a higher form of analyzing and understanding reality. In other words, when we look at reality, there's only so much that we can understand, and human beings are usually left bewildered because we can't make sense of it all. But that's where our connection to God gives us a foothold in something that is permanent, and not just permanent, but also sees beyond the limited capacity of the human mind. And so when the Torah makes an injunction, so it's connecting me to the divine mind, to the divine will. Now, what it turns out, first thing we can learn from this is that Moses is somewhere in between, because he intuitively was able to intuit what God was about to later command. And he did it out of seeking the benefits, the natural benefits that would come from the Sabbath. So Moses, in a certain sense, we considered him, that's why we call him Moshe Rabbeinu, which means Moshe, our teacher. Moses, our teacher. Because he teaches us, as much as we can grasp, the divine mind, the divine will. He's an intermediary in that sense. He has an intuition about what God wants. But that's not all of it. Because there's something very important here to understand. That even though we're connecting to the divine mind, and the considerations there and the thought process is different than ours, if something is beneficial for us, it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to discount that benefit. In other words, and this is where it gets Hasidic, let's call it. This is where we have to walk the paradoxical line between human reason and divine reason. Just because I see something as beneficial doesn't mean that God doesn't see it as beneficial. it may very well be that what I see as good is exactly what God sees as good. Still, I shouldn't do it for that reason, but it doesn't supersede that reason. In other words, God is not telling me to do something that will necessarily not be beneficial the way I understand it. On the contrary, if the way I understand it, how it's beneficial for me to perform this commandment, if that is something that my mind understands, it should also be part of performing the commandment. Now, before we say that as a blanket statement, we have to add that in the Talmud, in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, there's a whole discussion about this. Are the commandments made and intended to give us benefit? In Hebrew, we call that hana'ah. Should I get pleasure? Should I get benefit from performing the commandments? And the simple understanding there's only one, there's actually a little bit of a dispute, but not very much. And one of the sages of the Talmudic period, Rava, he says, Mitzvoth lav lehenot nitu. Commandments were not given for us to receive benefit from them. And so a lot of people understood this as if you do receive benefit from it, it's a problem. But that's not actually the case. And there's been a lot of discussion about this principle. Does this principle also turn into saying that if you receive benefit, you haven't performed the commandment? In other words, if I have benefit from the commandment, does that automatically mean that I'm not doing it because God commanded? Am I able to paradoxically hold within myself both the benefit that I'm receiving from the commandment and the fact that it was God who commanded it and I'm not doing it for my benefit? So many times Rav Ginsburg has talked about this principle and discussed it in length, and it really is a very complex issue. But the bottom line that he says is that in our generations, you really can't convince anyone to follow the Torah if they don't see the benefit of it. That really what people are seeking in the end is to have a connection. They're seeking to have community. They're seeking to gain benefit in their lives. They're seeking a better life. They understand, and they, or at least hope, that by following the Torah, they improve their lives. It's true that during the 2,000 years of exile that we're in the last throes of it, but we're still in it. The only way to survive was to sort of discount this whole topic of benefit and to come and say, we don't need the benefit at all. So that Rava's principle in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah is like, you should not receive any benefit. Do not expect to receive any benefit. But as the exile ends, and we know that in the time of the temple, when a person brought a sacrifice, they received benefit from the sacrifice. They received atonement. They received, in the case of peace offerings, they ate from it. There was a lot of benefit that was received from it. And so there's actually a principle that says that Rava was talking in the Talmudic era, which is 300, 400 years after the destruction of the temple. But once the temple is rebuilt, the principle will actually be that the commandments were made to give us benefit. And it's like saying that once the temple is built, it's easier for a person to contain this paradox. On the one hand, to do the commandments because God commanded them. On the other hand, to be willing and able to accept the benefit without it negating in any way the fact that he's performing God's will. So with this, we'll end today, and I hope to see you tomorrow. All the best.